Well, I'm gonna do a little something a little different today. For Christmas, I'm not gonna wear this the whole time. Or if it gets cold, I might. Actually, it is kind of chilly now. Um, I wanted to talk about the historicity of the birth narrative of Jesus for this Christmas occasion, and I'm not really sure who my 21 subscribers are, or who might see this video. But in any case, I wanted to talk a little bit about how I came about to have some clearer idea after many years of Bible study as to the historicity of the two birth narratives of Jesus in Matthew and Luke. And the occasion for that was actually a seminar I took as an active auditor at the Pontifical Biblical Commission, or the Pontifical Biblical Institute, rather, in Rome, a course on Josephus and the New Testament by a very prominent scholar of Josephus and of late Second Temple Judaism, with the Pharisees and the Maccabee period and all that stuff. Joseph Sievers, who became a priest, I think by that time, this is 2011, he became a priest associated with the Focolare movement. He's German, quite a nice, somewhat timid man. And so this seminar was very, very interesting. And of course, I participated and wrote the required final paper and presented it. So I say that by way of, that what I am going to say now is not something condemned by the Catholic Church or anything, but it is a very, I would say, anti-fundamentalistic view that is reflective of mainstream, contemporary biblical scholarship, whether by Jews, Protestants, or Catholics. The people that are sort of left out of this are fundamentalists, people that take the Bible literally the wrong way. I think the Bible should be taken literally the right way. And I have a lot of notes on that in my intro to the Bible notes from my website, Emilio Chavez Bible Explainer. You should be able to Google that and get my website. So these are class notes that I compiled, that I wrote when I was teaching at the Catholic Regional Seminary for Florida. But I was on sabbatical, actually, sabbatical semester in Rome when I took this course on Josephus and the New Testament. And today I'll probably go longer than the usual 20 minutes I do. I've been doing Epistle to the Hebrews. That's kind of on hold right now. I did 7 or 8 sessions of introduction, and I do a regular Spanish daily video, 13 minutes for spiritual and biblical topics. But so this came out of this Pontifical Biblical Institute seminar, and what you see here is a page of my 4-page, so it's brief, implications of the study of Josephus. It can be found on my web site. I'll kind of show you how to do that. If I go to my Bible Explainer, it says not secure, just because I haven't paid extra to have some seal of security, but it's secure. Trust me, there's nothing going on with this website. And then I have these short notes on biblical topics. And I think I just want to show you where it might be. Implications is probably called. Implications of the study of Josephus for the historicity of the New Testament. But this is page 2 of that, that paper. And so what the course we used as a basic text, a book by Steve Mason called Josephus and the New Testament, which uh, was highly praised by Joseph Sievers as uh, Steve Mason being the greatest expert right now on Josephus. At least 10 years ago he was, and he's probably still very, very, very good. And I think he's one of these guys, a little bit like Bart Ehrman, who were raised very conservative and then sort of go the other way. But science is science. By the way, I can't resist repeating, but the Pontifical Biblical Commission document from 1993, the interpretation of the Bible in the church, says about fundamentalism. It devotes various pages to it. I highly recommend you Google the interpretation of the Bible in the church by the Pontifical Biblical Commission, headed by Cardinal Ratzinger at the time, presented to Pope John Paul II in 1993. And it goes on about the fallacies of taking the Bible literally and unscientifically, and it calls fundamentalism a form of intellectual suicide. So one of my purposes here today is to prevent anybody committing or continuing to commit intellectual suicide, if that makes any sense. So I knew from many years of Bible study that the Bible writers take great liberties with history, if they even had a notion of history like we have. And we are very aware of prejudices and baggage and points of view and blind spots and whatever purposes can come into the writing of history. But in antiquity, it was even more free, and in the Oriental world, even more free. And so, for example, in this paper, I start out discussing, and basically, I really follow Mason, so I don't know that I do anything really um, innovative or new, except what I'm trying to do today as a Catholic believer, practicing Catholic believer, and I consider myself quite orthodox in the Vatican II sense and Pope Francis sense, which many people that I think are ultra radical don't like, and I don't want to get too much into that, but I'm very strong on that point. I knew that they took liberties, and as I said, even Mason discusses the fact that Josephus, in his two main works, Josephus was a first century Jewish historian, roughly contemporary with Jesus. He was born, I think, probably a little after Jesus. I forget his dates now, and he died after the Jewish War, which he wrote about, a Jewish war that ended in 73 with Masada, and he was on like a writing grant in Rome after having predicted that I think it was Titus or Vespasian would become emperor. And so he wrote in Aramaic and also in Greek, and he published two great works, The Antiquities of the Jews, in many volumes, and he also wrote The War of the Jews, in which he had been a general in Galilee. He has firsthand knowledge of all this stuff. And of course, he's famous for having written about Jesus briefly and John the Baptist more extensively in that order. And it's very interesting, and I don't want to get into all that stuff now, but nevertheless, he is a historian with his own, axis to grind, and we're not taking Josephus as biblical truth. But it just so happens that, according to Mason's very respectable theory, in the particular points I am going to discuss, which are specifically the census that is famous. They went down from Nazareth, the Holy Family went down from Nazareth, or at least Joseph and Mary went down from Nazareth to Bethlehem because of this census. And then I might even get into the massacre of the Holy Innocents in Matthew as two events that where Josephus can be really taken very, very seriously. And I'll explain why in these particular two events Josephus is credible as a historian. In other things, even Mason points out, and I'm going to read from this, evidently consistency doesn't matter to Josephus. Everything serves his present rhetorical needs. So he can say one thing in Antiquities and the opposite in War of the Jews. So being consistent is not his main goal, if it was the main goal of any historian in antiquity. He's supposed to be writing in Rome to an audience already favorably disposed toward Jews, and he's trying to explain to this audience that the Jewish uprising in Palestine, of which he knew all about, being intimately involved and having escaped and surrendered, that sort of thing. Some consider him a turncoat, etc. That is not an unusual rebelliousness of Jews, but bad leaders and oppression and extreme exploitation, even by the Romans, caused this desperation, very ill advised. Josephus famously calls these subversives or revolutionaries lestai, which is like a bandit. He doesn't call them freedom fighters. He calls them lestai, which are the same kinds of evildoers crucified with Jesus. They are called lestai, or Jesus himself in Greek, the Greek version of the temple cleansing. Quotes Jeremiah, which the translation for these violent bloodshedders, Peritzim, in Greek is lestai, highwaymen, robbers, not so much the cause, but rather they're violent and, cruel, if you want, and ill-advised behavior. So that we're not taking Josephus as some sort of, corrective to everything the New Testament says. But I want to get started with the Lucan narrative about this census and see some rather interesting things, not taking too long, but I anticipate this is going to be longer than 20 minutes. Luke is the one that has these Mary and Joseph already, Mary having conceived by the Holy Spirit. So there is agreement between Matthew and Luke that Jesus was virginally conceived. No human father was involved in the conception of Jesus. Mary conceived by the Holy Spirit. We have two of the four sources attesting to this. So it is, not the four source attestation, not all four gospels say this, but these two gospels do say that. So that's something that Christians believe fervently, that Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit, not by by Joseph siring him or being the father. Uh, and it's interesting. I just want to say, if you look at the great book of The Birth of the Messiah by Raymond Brown many years ago, he makes the point that the Messiah was not expected to be born of a virgin. The prophecy in Isaiah 7:14, which I assume many people, I hope some people are familiar with, in Hebrew, of course, has that famous, the Alma, this young marriageable woman, but not necessarily a reference to her virginity. It is the Greek translation in the Septuagint, the 70, that translates Alma by Parthenos, virgin, and um, and Matthew finds that extremely handy to as another instance of these many fulfillments of Scripture, which this Gospel of Matthew is all about. The famous Harvard scholar, later Bishop of Sweden, Christer Stendhal, great man. I had the privilege of meeting him and all that at Harvard. He wrote The School of St. Matthew, uh, positing the thesis that the Matthean community was a group of Bible scholars that poured through these Jewish scriptures trying to find fulfillments, and they do that in a very creative Jewish way, etc. We can't get into all that, but definitely to be able to sort of substantiate a tradition that Raymond Brown says is Palestinian and ancient, that did not have a human father. It's very convenient to corroborate that in Matthew. Luke doesn't do it quite the same way at all. Doesn't quote Isaiah 7:14. But Matthew does, and it's very convenient to say that the virgin shall conceive and bear a son and shall call him Emmanuel, which is sort of a bookend at the beginning of Matthew with the bookend at the end. I am with you always till the end of the world. God with us. And even in the middle, Matthew 18, you've got where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am in your midst. So Matthew's all about finding these scriptures, some of them extremely obscure, like he shall be called a Nazarene. And I think probably as he does in other places, like in chapter 27, he mistakes, quote unquote, Zechariah for Jeremiah. I think these are all deliberate errors, which should be read literally the right way, as sort of hyperlinks opening up to another world of citations and references in Jeremiah, taking for granted that everybody knows the 30 pieces of silver that Judas sold Jesus for are the 30 pieces of silver of Zechariah, which in turn is the princely sum, ironic, measly sum of the price of a slave gored by an ox in Exodus. So that these mistakes of Matthew are to be taken literally and not as mistakes like unintentionally. He thought it was Jeremiah, but it was really Zechariah. Trust me, of course, Matthew knows a lot about Zechariah. He knows all this stuff, whoever Matthew was, or his community, or Bible scholars. And so, um, these are things that make us go into Jeremiah and look at the field of blood and the potter, all kinds of stuff that I can't get into now, but I have pages of that in my intro to the Bible notes in the second part, thorny issues. But getting back then to Luke, you have this census. So Luke talks about a census that took place, and I would say he's basically thinking around the time that Jesus was born. give or take 10 years. Because I think Jesus was born 4 BC. Most scholars would say he was born from 6 to 4 BC during the reign of Herod the Great, something that Matthew says. Luke doesn't mention the reign of Herod the Great. If you look at the Lucan list of world, scenario, which is the purpose of this, to situate Jesus's birth in an international historical setting. You've got Caesar Augustus, you've got Quirinius, governor of Syria, and then later he might, mention Herod, some other Herod, but but he doesn't quite um, mention Herod in the birth of Jesus. So what's the issue? The issue is that the only census we know of is this census in 6 CE or AD, which is mentioned in Acts of the Apostles, which resulted in the revolt by Judas the Galilean. And what Mason says about Josephus is that this is the cornerstone of Josephus's history. He could tweak many things in his historical accounts, different as they may be in Antiquities and War of the Jews. But the start of all the uproar or tumults or discontent that would culminate in the rising up of the Jews in 66 AD, resulting in the destruction of the temple in 70 AD by the Romans, razed to the ground, and in the further holdout of the Masada people, that fortress up there, up to 73 AD, that census was crucial for Josephus. And it turns out that if you study this census, this was a census when Quirinius became governor of Syria, and it was for taxation purposes, especially of real estate and property held in place, in situ. There was no way that you would have people have to travel from all over the empire to, something like a native city, in this case Bethlehem, because Joseph was a descendant of David, so he had to go to Bethlehem. There's absolutely no record of that in any historical source. It would have caused an upheaval throughout the whole empire. It would be noted that this nut made everybody go, to their native place, for this census to be registered. And so it's incredibly unhistorical in the sense that the reason for the Joseph and Mary going from Nazareth to Bethlehem, because of a census that required Joseph to go there, doesn't really make any sense. Luke knows of this census. He writes about it in Acts. The real census we know about, 6 AD, meaning that from 4 BC to 6 AD, there's a 10-year gap. And Luke is comfortable saying, there was a census. And the reason that I would say, poetically or literarily constructing is, this is a family in Nazareth, but the Messiah has to be born in Bethlehem because of the Micah prophecy, which Luke doesn't really get into. Matthew does. But Luke simply has a tradition shared by Matthew that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. The evidence for that is, according to Brown, weaker than for the virginal conception. The virginal conception is not really based on an Isaiah prophecy, because there was no such interpretation of the Messiah being born of a virgin. But even the Talmud apparently recognizes that the birth of Jesus was unusual. Now, probably the Talmud is explaining it or even using it for its own purposes to denigrate Jesus. And the Talmud says that his real father was uh, Panthera, a Roman legionnaire, may have raped Mary. And this is where this Parthenos comes from. Virgin comes from really a sort of a tweaking or misunderstanding of the name of the real father, Panthera, some sort of Roman legionnaire or something, which is less likely than even just thinking of a virginal conception, I suppose, because evidence for a Panthera raping Mary is, I think, nil. And so some people say even the Talmud recognizes there was something unusual. Now, of course, they would say he was a mamzer, a bastard, a man born out of wedlock. I think Bruce Childs, if I get his name, Chilton, a great Aramaic scholar with some wacky ideas, please forgive me, he thinks that this whole mamzer thing was a big complex for Jesus being a bastard, etc., illegitimate. I'm not really getting into that, but I'm trying to get into why Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and Luke thinks he was born in Bethlehem. What is stronger is that he's from the tribe of David. He's from the tribe of Judah. That is strong. In the letter to the Hebrews, the book of Revelation, he wasn't from the Levitical tribe of priests, etc. He was from the tribe of Judah. And, that is stronger evidence. I'm showing something here for myself to read in Spanish. Most people won't be able to read it, even if you can even read this small sort of print. But it's interesting to compare two very classic Catholic Bibles, the Jerusalem Bible in Spanish, which I like. It happens to be, I think, the most literal Bible in Spanish, aside from the oftentimes too literal Protestant translations, Reina Valera, etc. Those are like very slavishly following the Latin Vulgate, which is very, very literal, which I like. But I think they sometimes go overboard. But the point being that the Jerusalem Bible 1973, in the note to Luke 2:2, says this: the historical circumstances of this census are obscure. The majority of critics place the census of Quirinius 6 AD, but with the only authority of Josephus, with Josephus as the only authority, which doesn't inspire confidence. So even in this point, they're saying Josephus is not reliable. Mason, later, and I think with a lot of arguments, is showing that in this particular point, Josephus is reliable. We'll see what happens in the following edition in a second. The most probable thing is that this census took place around 8 or to 6 BC in relationship to a general census of the empire that was organized in Palestine by Quirinius, who had a special mission for this. So that it's kind of trying to salvage, in 1973, the Jerusalem Bible in Spanish, trying to salvage the historicity of Luke by saying there was a census, even though nobody else knows about it, but there was. This is what the 1998 new edition, by the way, these are all based on the French edition of the Jerusalem Bible in 73 with great scholars. In 98, sort of a diminished group at the Jacobi Bleak in Jerusalem. But the new edition says, given that Josephus dates the census under Quirinus at 6 AD, the chronology of the birth of Jesus offered by Luke does not agree with that of Matthew, according to which Jesus was born before the death of Herod the Great in 4 BC, maybe during the years 8 to 6 BC. The fact is that the census of Judea under Quirinus had great resonance. Everybody knew about it. Its occasion was the reorganization of the country as a procuratorial province, a province under a procurator, like maybe Pontius Pilate, after the deposition when they took down as ethnarch Archelaus, son of Herod, which provoked the insurrection of Judas the Galilean that Acts 5, verse 37 talks about. So you see there's a development in good Catholic biblical studies from 73, Jerusalem Bible in Spanish, very sort of following the French master source. And then when you go 25 years later, 1998, you have, a change in how they view the validity of Josephus in this instance. The whole totality of circumstances, meaning nobody's heard of this other census. That's crazy. You go from every part of the empire to another to some ancestral town for what to say. I'm here, present, and where's your property? How do we know what to tax you? Which is what they're interested in. They're not interested in, a little census for anything. So that is a problem. And I think that it's Luke's way of presenting a reason why the Joseph and Mary had to leave their home in Nazareth to go down to Bethlehem, where they knew nobody apparently, and there's no room for them in the kataluma in Greek. No room for them in the upper quarters is my translation. No room for them in the inn. I would leave the word inn for the parable of the Good Samaritan, where that other word, pandejos, is used. That's an inn. But this kataluma is the same word used in Mark and copied by Luke for the place of the Last Supper. So Mark doesn't have a birth narrative. He doesn't talk about a manger. A manger is where the animals eat. But Luke says they placed him in a manger where animals eat because there was no room in the kataluma, the upper quarters. So they put him probably in the lower quarters where the animals were, keeping the house warm or something. And then for the Last Supper, Jesus says, where is my upper room, my kataluma, that I may celebrate the Passover with my disciples? Luke is linking the birth of Jesus and Jesus as food with the Last Supper, where Jesus gives his broken body and pours his blood as spiritual nourishment associated with his passion. So the shadow of the cross is already present in the birth of Jesus in Luke. So I think that that's enough for that, because I don't want to get real long. And I don't even know how this thing uploads when it's quite that long, but this is going to go, a while, 50 minutes maybe, if I'm sort of lucky. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about then is Matthew. And if you see Matthew, there's reference to a house. There's reference to a house that Jesus is born in Bethlehem. There's no mention of Nazareth until later. So that, let me see if I can quickly bring up Matthew in this thing. Um, in Matthew, they have a house, and that is where the magi go. You know, and there's no problem with finding room in the inn. Now, a biblical concordist or a guy that wants to cut and paste the Gospels. He says, well, at first they didn't have a place to stay, but then they kind of got more organized and found a house, And yes, the first time the shepherds came to visit, but now the Magi came to visit. Well, you can't cut and paste Gospels and destroy the message and intent of and integrity of each Gospel composition. Of course, the challenge is, this is part of my purpose in this, the challenge is to have to think enough to both believe that God is communicating to us without having to take it literally the wrong way, like it's some sort of a newspaper. Even those are maybe not objective. You have to understand the message. And yes, there's a historical kernel and substratum. And I think the principal one is that Jesus was miraculously, virginally conceived, and his real father is God. There's not even a concern as to whether Mary and Joseph had relations afterwards. Catholic dogma is Mary remained perpetually a virgin. But the New Testament itself, and we should, if we dialogue with our separated brethren, whatever the correct expression is now, our brother Protestants or whatever, is to respect what the Bible says and then say, well, we extrapolate or we have teleogumena or theological conclusions as to some of these things by a very ancient tradition, extremely old, maybe older than yours, whatever. My father's, bigger than your father, that sort of thing. But basically speaking, if we understand the Bible, they are making the point, Matthew and Luke, not so much Mark and John, that Jesus' real father was God the Father and not human Joseph. And then, with weaker evidence, he was born in Bethlehem. Certainly from the tribe of Judah, but if you look at Matthew, he's simply born there. There's no housing issue. They have a house, and there's this guiding star that I don't want to get too involved and make this too long. I think this is definitely the star of Numbers 24, the star of Jacob, a scepter, messianic star. If you looked at it if my Bible almost opens automatically. If you look at it in Greek, it's called it's an anatele. He rises up like the rising sun from the east, which is another messianic expression, Anatole. Just like Zema, the sprout in Hebrew, agricultural term for the Messiah. He sprouts from the ground, and Zema. And in Greek, they rendered it astrologically, Anatole, the rising sun from the east. Audience in Latin. And so this is the messianic star, which, by the way, gives the name to the Jewish messianic upriser in 132 AD. So 100 plus years later, Bar Kokhba is the son of the star, messianic star. But my point is that these people live in Bethlehem. They have a house, and shepherds are not present. But what you have are these magi, these Babylonian, probably astrologers, wise men, famous, around the world, bearing these gifts, just like Psalm 72, very messianic psalm read in these Christmas days. Lord, with your judgment endow the king, and with your righteousness the king's justice, etc., the son of the king. The kings of Sabah and Sheba will bring tributes, etc., offer presents. And so that's where you get the three wise men. In Spanish, we like to say los reyes magos, the maybe magical kings, but it would be king magi, basically, kings magi or magi kings. So they make these scientific astrologer types into also kings. And so, just to finish up a little bit, they flee to Egypt with the massacre of the innocents. I do want to say something about that. That's why this is going to take a little bit longer than usual. Mason is very interesting here. He knows Josephus very well, and he knows that Josephus is intent on showing how evil Herod the Great was. That in fact, horrible rulers like Herod the Great were what antagonized the common persons enough to explain and lead to that uprising in 66, aside from other revolts like maybe Judas the Galilean in 6 AD. And he says, towards the end of Herod's reign, Josephus has incredible detailed information. Had Josephus known of a massacre of innocents 2 years and under in the contours of Bethlehem, he would have loved to include that. He includes lesser, let's call them peccadillos. He includes lesser offenses of Josephus, just building up his case, what a horrible guy Josephus was, as a cornerstone of his thesis, writing this book to the Roman audience, saying, Romans, Jews are very wise and orderly people. We go back to Moses. We're not rabble rousers. Don't buy the propaganda that we rose up in Palestine and did the Jewish war, which was a real pain in your neck, because that Jewish uprising, bless them, made the Romans sweat a lot. And people were not happy with having to go over there and fight these little Jews that knew how to fight. And so Josephus is explaining the reason they rose up is not because they're unruly, subversive people. They were fed up with bad rulers. Just like any other people would rise up, Jews are not different in that regard. But when Josephus doesn't know anything about a massacre of innocents, and some of the studies say that, given populations and demographics, you may be talking about maybe 20 babies, babies at that age, etc. Could be like 20. The point being that Josephus gets into other details, even less significant, but doesn't know anything about this. So, what does a biblical scholar, a believer, say? Well, he would say that Matthew is very famous for these midrashic, a Jewish method of reading the Bible where you read certain events or depict them by having searched other biblical texts. Darash is the Hebrew verb for searching. And you get a midrash, which is this combining of text and commentary on text by precisely relating one to the other. And how do you do what Luke did with that kataluma upper room reference when Jesus was born, which is a reference to the Passion? What you do in Matthew is you assimilate or make Jesus similar to Moses when he was born, because many people think that the Gospel of Matthew presents Jesus as a new Moses, starts from the mountain, etc., leads the Exodus, etc., the new final Exodus. Well, when Moses was born, they slaughtered baby boys too. And so this would explain um, the message that Jesus was destined from birth to suffer. And God has used this art. And I was reading about the artists when they built the temple in Exodus and Chronicles, I think, too. And the Pontifical Biblical Commission, I think, was going to cultivate that more than they finally did in a more recent document called The Inspiration and Truth of the Bible in the Church. I heard a presentation by Cardinal Ravasi, a learned cardinal. I think he's still in charge of culture in the church or something. Great Bible scholar. I heard him give a presentation while this document was being hammered out, and apparently when you start to get, maybe more conservative people in this Pontifical Biblical Commission of 20 people that produce these documents, they hesitated about overstressing the art nature of the Bible. The Bible is a work of art. The Bible is poetry. The Bible is not cold science or 6-day creation means God created in 6 days and then had to rest on the seventh. It's a priestly narrative, a beautiful diptych. Day 1, 2, 3 corresponding to day 4, 5, 6, and totally separate is Shabbat. So right from the first chapter of Genesis, you have the sanctification of probably the crucial Jewish observance, especially after the exile, the Sabbath. Very humanitarian and a very religious practice. And so when you read the Bible the right way, you discover the real message that God is communicating in human words, in human thinking type, in human art and artistic and literary forms, very sophisticated, much more than we can imagine if we haven't studied it. Even after we've studied it, we find surprises all the time. This is God communicating in a very, this is engraved in the minds of everybody. The shepherds on the one hand, I've got a nativity scene. The shepherds on the one hand, the magi on the other. There's no room in the inn. We kind of forget about this house business. And then, of course, just to finish up, how does Nazareth come up in Matthew? Well, they come back from Egypt, and they don't want to go back, I guess, to their house. It's almost like when the Jews got expelled from Spain, they took their keys with them, hoping to return one day to Toledo and places like that. But what they do is, I call it, they looked at the map and go, where are we going to go? They don't want to go back to Judea because Archelaus, the son of Herod, is there. That's too close for comfort. So they kind of look in the map and they say, oh, Nazareth sounds like just as good a place as any. And so they decide to go to Nazareth so that he shall be called a Nazarene, which is one, it says oracle of the prophets. And which one? There's probably several. The Jerusalem Bible note is very good. Natzer could be a root. You have Isaiah 49:8. A Nezer would be a shoot. You even have Nashur, the rest. You have Nazar to keep. You have the Nazirites, consecrated from Judges 13, or actually there's a number 6 one, which I don't know why it's not really listed here. But in any case, I mean, look at 49:8 might be the quiver. Let me see what that is. Isaiah 49:8 is, no, I kept you, I formed you, and I destined you to be the covenant to the people. And here, I don't know why it's not translated, but Natser would be I kept you. So, in other words, this is one of these little hyperlinks in Matthew. You rack your brains trying to literally find out which prophet said he shall be called a Nazarene, and what Matthew slyly but effectively and with the best intention, of course, just like with confusing Jeremiah and Zechariah in chapter 27, what Matthew here is doing is saying, search the scriptures, especially maybe in Hebrew, and find out how many possibilities there are, which is what the Jerusalem Bible has done. If you look at the footnote, Nazarene, it's a different form actually that he's using. There's various ways of spelling that. It talks about all the different possibilities. And I think I have that also in my intro to the Bible notes. Yes, in part 2, I deal with 7 problematic passages, confusing Ahimelech for Abiathar, for example, in the plucking grains on the Sabbath in Mark. I call that a deliberate mistake, not because he didn't know any better. And you can repeat instances of these deliberate errors for a purpose, not because of ignorance or incompetence. I have a whole section on how the Bible does have errors, material errors in cosmogony, and the animal kingdom, and how births take place, like almost like spontaneous generation. Later, they thought if you had a box full of dirty clothes, rats would mysteriously pop up instead of knowing that they came from elsewhere. The point being that we can reverently take the Bible. I do. I get goosebumps. But when we understand the sophistication that God has used or allow humans to use under his inspiration, we are, I think, more amazed than this flat fundamentalistic reading, which just squashes everything to a very low level, as if it's all faith and not reason. In the Catholic tradition, from Aquinas and many other places, faith and reason. Even Pope Pius XII, in his famous 1943 encyclical, the Divino Afflante Spiritu, says, yes, these are very tough, thorny issues. We're not going to put our head in the sand and say, no, there's no mistakes in the Bible. There's nothing in the Bible that's a problem. You got to just pray and figure it out. He goes, no, and let's call on biblical scholars to solve these, knowing that error is repugnant to divinity. It's not compatible to say God's inspired word has real errors. So I don't say that. But I do say that it reflects an ancient worldview in matters that are not directly related to our salvation. That's what Dei Verbum, I think number 10, says. God has consigned to writing that truth which is necessary for our salvation. Not that truth that will save us biology, will save us cosmology, will save us the Big Bang, will save us everything else. We don't have to think. It's the Bible. That is a fundamentalistic position that I repeat to conclude the church calls intellectual suicide. And we don't want anybody to be committing that. And especially nowadays when you have to think seriously about facts and avoid fake news and manipulation, throwing your hands up. I'm just going to believe this guy because the rest of it is too confusing for me. That's an abdication of your Homo sapiens, your man the knower, or human being the wise, if you will, calling that we have. Our nature is Homo sapiens, man the knower or man the wise. And if we abdicate our thinking capacity or never cultivated it, then we are not fulfilling our divine calling. And with that, I am going to stop.